Every day we hear about Russia as a military power, a nation that commands respect, or fear, on the global stage, owner of a nuclear arsenal capable of making anyone think twice before provoking it. They also talk about the tycoons flaunting gigantic yachts, the luxury skyscrapers in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and of course the leader who has spent decades in charge, always surrounded by mystery and controversy. But is life like that for every Russian? Does the population live in this glamour of champagne and caviar? Is this gigantic country really an example of development? Well, today, Bello Mundo is going to give you all the answers and show you the other side of this land full of extremes. We're going to get to know the reality of those who face winters of -20 degrees without a roof over their heads. Those who depend on soup served on a community bus to get dinner. Those who see their salaries evaporate as prices rise and public spending is cut. So get ready, because what you're about to learn could completely change your view of Russia. Number 1. Location and geographical data. If you type Russia into Google Maps, you'll see that the country occupies an absurd area. It is the largest on the planet, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Far East, with a land border that seems endless. There are 14 neighboring countries and 11 time zones. Russia's coastlines straddle 2 oceans, the Arctic in the frozen north and the Pacific in the Far East, which provides everything from frozen tundras to impressive volcanic landscapes. One of Russia's great features is its contrast. In the western part, where cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg are located, the continental climate imposes freezing winters and short summers, which can reach over 35 degrees. In Siberia, on the other hand, the cold reaches extremes. In some regions, thermometers reach -50 degrees, making Oymyakon, an isolated village, one of the coldest inhabited places on the planet. In the Far East, the Kamchatka Peninsula stands out for its active volcanoes, crystal-clear rivers, and the presence of bears fishing for salmon. Meanwhile, on the border with Mongolia and Kazakhstan, the arid steppes are reminiscent of Old West movie sets. To talk about Russia is to explore an entire universe within a single territory. But the big question remains: does this immensity translate into quality of life for those who live there? Well, you'll find out soon enough. Number 2. The Russia the world can see. In addition to its location, extreme climate, and diverse landscapes, this nation is seen in a very specific way by the world. And probably, when you hear the word Russia, images come to mind of the military parades in Red Square, the geopolitical power that intimidates, and of course, President Vladimir Putin riding shirtless. Okay, today, he may be a bit washed up, but back then, women were melted by the image, meme after meme, a veritable online phenomenon, remembered to this day, by the way. Jokes aside, this tough guy image has established what many people imagine about the country. Russia is also synonymous with vodka, the Bolshoi Ballet, the literary classics of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and the imposing past of the Soviet Union, which rivaled the United States in almost everything, from the space race to military power. Many people still imagine a country full of spies, hackers, and limitless political influence. And let's face it, it's not as if this fame came out of nowhere. The KGB may have changed its name, but in practice the game remains the same. Today, the Russian intelligence services operate under new acronyms, but they continue at the same pace, monitoring, manipulating, and interfering in governments and elections around the world. And Russia does have influence. The country is an energy powerhouse with vast reserves of oil and natural gas. and it is precisely this gas that gives Moscow immense economic and political power, especially in Europe, where many countries depend on it to heat their homes in winter. Moscow is the financial, political, and cultural heart of the country. The city buzzes with activity, is home to the country's billionaires, and shows off its luxury with five-star hotels, designer stores, sophisticated malls, and trendy restaurants. St. Petersburg, to the north, is no exception. It's a veritable open-air museum, full of canals, palaces, and architecture that harks back to the time of the Tsars. But that's not all there is to Russia. Behind the spotlight, there's a reality that rarely appears on postcards, and we're going to take you to it now. Number 3. History and transformations. To understand how poverty became a structural problem in Russia, we need to go back in time a little. In the Russian Empire, which existed before the revolution of 1917, inequality was extreme. Most of the population were peasants, living in poverty and working for nobles and large landowners, while the elite paraded around in gilded palaces, oblivious to the harsh reality. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution, led by Lenin, who promised to end exploitation and build an egalitarian society. The Soviet Union fought 2 world wars, became a superpower, and invested heavily in education, health, and science. On paper, poverty was eradicated, but in practice the country suffered from a lack of freedom, shortages of goods, and rationing. The real collapse came in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Without planning, Russia was plunged into a brutal economic transition known as shock therapy. State companies were sold off at ridiculous prices, a new caste of billionaire oligarchs emerged, while millions lost their jobs, savings, and any financial security. The 90s were chaos. Factories closed, pensions lost value, wages were eroded by inflation, and crime soared. The country was trying to adapt to capitalism, but without the necessary structure, which filled the streets with homeless people and reignited hunger in many families. In the 2000 years, with the price of oil soaring, the Russian economy took a breather. But it was short-lived. Since 2014, international sanctions, applied because of the conflict in Ukraine, have shaken the economy even more. And yes, since 2014, it's been a long story, and not just about the recent invasion of 2022. Oil fell, inflation soared, and poverty began to grow again. Today, the situation is like this. Those who were already rich are still millionaires, but those at the bottom of the pyramid are facing ever greater difficulties. In other words, Russia has not only inherited the problems of the past, but continues to create new challenges for the future. Number 4. Poverty in Russia. Talking about poverty in Russia is not the same as talking about extreme misery, as in countries where there is a mass lack of drinking water or basic sanitation. But that doesn't mean the situation is any less worrying. According to official government statistics, around 13 million Russians live below the poverty line, and President Putin himself, shortly before being re-elected once again, admitted that the population's low income is one of the country's biggest concerns, and promised to work to reverse it. Campaign promise or not, the fact is that poverty has remained a reality for millions of Russians ever since. But what does it mean to be poor in Russia? Well, Being poor in Russia means earning less than you need to cover basic expenses such as housing, food, and transportation. In big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the high cost of living makes renting a challenge, while in the countryside, low wages make it difficult even to buy essential items at a reduced cost. The impact varies. Families having to choose between heating their homes or buying quality food, pensioners with tiny pensions, workers migrating to the cities and ending up in shelters, and rural communities that look more like ghost towns. Whether it's urban or rural, relative or absolute poverty, the fact is that it exists and affects millions of Russians every day. Number 5. Housing. If there's one place where poverty is even more evident, it's in housing. During the Soviet era, the government built low-income apartment blocks, the famous Khrushchevkas, or panela. These buildings were hastily constructed, especially to accommodate families who had lost their homes in the war or who were migrating from the countryside to the cities. To this day, these buildings make up a large part of the Russian urban landscape. Some of these houses have been renovated, but many are still falling apart. For many families, staying in these buildings is the only option, as the rents are more affordable. But even so, for those who earn little, being able to afford minimally decent housing is still a huge challenge. And that's where the new face of Russian poverty comes in. People who even have a job but can't afford a decent place to live. Many end up crammed into tiny apartments, sharing rooms with relatives or friends. Others end up in illegal squats or have to sleep in temporary shelters. There aren't huge open-air slums like in other countries, but there are neighborhoods that are real hotbeds of poverty, often isolated from the rest of the city, with poor infrastructure, little government assistance, and high rates of crime and drug use. And there are still those who live in the countryside, in unheated houses, without running water, facing winters of sub-zero temperatures for months at a time. And in such a cold land, lack of heating isn't just uncomfortable, it's life-threatening. Yet there is a class of people who don't even have a roof over their heads. Number 6. Homeless. If you're walking around Moscow, you might not realize it right away, but the number of people without permanent housing has risen sharply in recent years. It is estimated that around 100,000 people live on the streets of the Russian capital. In St. Petersburg, the situation is not much different either. Non-profit organizations estimate that more than 60,000 people are homeless, facing cold, hunger, and a lack of assistance on a daily basis. An example of this are the images you are seeing on your screen. This report was produced by the Spanish branch of German broadcaster DW, which followed the work of a former naval officer who, faced with the crisis, decided to take action on his own, distributing meals to those who have nothing to eat. The video reveals the harsh reality of the streets and shows how, in the midst of precariousness, voluntary initiatives end up being the only hope for thousands of vulnerable people. And where do these people sleep? In the open spaces of abandoned buildings, train stations, subway tunnels, or sewage systems, anywhere that offers minimal shelter from the cold. The price is high, illness due to the poor conditions and lack of assistance, and many don't survive the harsh winter. NGOs and religious groups try to help, but Russian bureaucracy further complicates the situation. To access state shelters, you need a residence permit, something many homeless people don't have. While the government claims to have assistance programs, many experts criticize them, claiming that public policies fail to meet demand and impose too many barriers. In a country where winter can kill, homelessness is more than a social problem. It's a death sentence. Number 7. Who are the most affected? Poverty in Russia has no single face. It affects different social groups, such as former workers in state-owned factories, elderly people with low pensions, and immigrants from the former Soviet republics who, when looking for opportunities, end up trapped in difficulties. The elderly are among the most vulnerable. Many live on very low pensions, sometimes the equivalent of $160 a month, which barely covers food and medicine. It's not uncommon to see pensioners rummaging through garbage in search of bottles to get change. Single women, especially solo mothers, also face great difficulties dealing with underemployment and the lack of public creches, which makes it difficult to reconcile work and children. Immigrants from countries such as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan face double barriers: low-paid jobs and xenophobia, making it difficult for them to move up the social ladder. Refugees from war zones face bureaucracy, prejudice, and often a lack of access to basic rights. In the countryside, the lack of infrastructure, such as roads, hospitals, and schools, makes the future uncertain, and many young people end up migrating to the cities. While the richest 10% concentrate much of the wealth, millions live without a safety net. Poverty is made even more difficult by the high rates of HIV, tuberculosis, alcoholism, and even hunger crises in some regions. Number 8. Public policies. Despite the image of a strong state, Russia does not have as comprehensive a welfare system as other countries. There are family allowances, pensions, and emergency aid, but these benefits are often insufficient. A big problem is bureaucracy. Many public services depend on the propiska, official residence registration. If someone moves to Moscow without updating their registration, they can lose access to basic services such as health, education, and even shelters. This policy dates back to the Soviet era and still affects those who migrate within the country in search of opportunities. With no effective public policy in place, NGOs, Orthodox churches, and independent groups are doing their best to alleviate the situation by distributing soup and cold clothes, helping to obtain documents, and setting up emergency shelters. But given the seriousness of the situation, these efforts are insufficient. It's like wiping ice. International economic sanctions and rising prices for basic items have made conditions even worse. The government has prioritized investments in strategic and military sectors, reducing resources for social programs. As a result, those already living in poverty are even more vulnerable, with no prospect of improvement. Number 9. Racism, prejudice, and urban overpopulation. And now let's talk about a problem that goes hand in hand with poverty: prejudice. Russia is not exactly known for being open to diversity, and when it comes to racial discrimination and xenophobia, the situation gets even more complicated. People of African, Caucasian, and Central Asian origin face daily barriers to getting jobs, renting accommodation, and even simply walking down the street without getting crossed eyes or hostile approaches. But don't think that prejudice is limited to foreigners. Even Russians who come from the countryside or the most remote regions of the country are discriminated against when they try to start life again in the big cities. Those who don't have official residency registration, the famous propiska, are stuck in informal jobs without labor rights and often exploited in underemployment, cleaning, construction, delivery services, private security, among others. This influx of people in search of opportunities overcrowds big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. While villages and small towns remain empty. The contrast is absurd. Metropolises face traffic, high living costs, and a housing crisis, while rural regions are left abandoned with no infrastructure and no prospects for development. The result? Overcrowded suburbs, expensive rents, and growing inequality. Those who can't afford the high rents end up in tiny apartments or precarious conditions. While Moscow shows off its luxurious buildings, the invisible Russia continues to grow, far from the spotlight, ignored by the government itself, and this reality is only going to get worse. In short, the future is cloudy. And so we come to the end of this tour of poverty in Russia, a topic that is far removed from the postcards and news reports that focus only on military power or political disputes. But what about you? What did you think of this other side of Russia? Did it surprise you to learn that there are so many homeless people in Moscow, that there are rural areas that are practically forgotten? Let us know in the comments. We want to know what you think. And if you enjoyed learning more about this little explored side of Russia, keep an eye out, because Bello Mundo still has a lot to show you. Until the next adventure.